Welcome to another edition of the Hawk Off the Press podcast. I'm your host, Gazette Hawkeyes reporter John Steppe. I'm excited to welcome back Doug Lesmerises to the podcast. Doug, a past guest. I think this is your first time with this role, though, correct?
Yes, in my new venture. I believe that is correct.
So, former Cleveland.com columnist that I think Iowa fans may remember his work from a couple of years ago with the Iowa-Ohio State game. Now has the Kings of the North show, which, correct me if I'm misdescribing this, but a daily YouTube show focusing on Northern college football.
That is a good description, John. So yes, thank you. We are Monday through Thursday at noon Eastern, live on YouTube. It's also then available everywhere you listen to podcasts. We put it up as soon as the show's over. And then we do a Friday morning show that's taped that goes up on college football betting. We do that Friday morning for half an hour. And then we do a live post-game show at 11 Eastern on Saturday nights. So it's 90 minutes, noon to 1:30 Eastern, Monday through Thursday. And we have 28 teams that we cover. So it's basically the top half of the country, and we deal with the Power Four. So it's everybody in the Big Ten except USC and UCLA because it's too sunny in LA. It's the top half of the Big 12. So Kansas, Kansas State, Colorado, Utah, BYU, Iowa State, West Virginia, and Cincinnati. Then it's Notre Dame, Pitt, Syracuse, and Boston College. So like the top half, because we figure there's enough people talking about Georgia and Alabama and Texas.
Well, let's first of all talk about one of the things that you were talking about earlier this week, and something that everyone here in Iowa has been talking about a lot too. Kaleb Johnson, leading the country in total rushing yards, second in rushing yards per game through 4 weeks. You even brought up the H word there with Heisman. It seems like he's putting up, it's only 4 weeks, but it seems like he has at least made the case through 4 weeks to at least be in the conversation.
So when we started talking about this, we started talking about it on Saturday night on the live post-game show after his performance against Minnesota. And when the guy has 9 rushing touchdowns in 4 games and at least 2 per game, and he demolishes Minnesota in the second half, we're having the conversation, and I looked on one of the betting apps on my phone, and I don't think this was wrong. I'm not a smart man. I'm capable of making mistakes. But I think the app I looked at had 85 different people listed in the Heisman odds, and he was not one of them. And I was outraged. I was angry. I thought to myself, if this guy was a running back at Tennessee or Ole Miss or LSU, this would never happen. What are we doing? So then we decided that we're going to lead our Monday show with the Kaleb Johnson Heisman case. And we did that on Kings of the North on Monday for about 20 minutes. And by then, I think he was 28th in the odds. He was on the app. It's like, hey, they acknowledged Iowa football. So I think there's a case to be made. And I think right now, and I am a Heisman voter, the 2 people that I think right now would be on my ballot for sure on a 3-person ballot are Kaleb Johnson and Travis Hunter. And the idea that like he was not, after having 6 rushing touchdowns in the first 3 games and averaging whatever, 160 yards a game, that he wasn't even in the conversation. It's like why we're here on Kings of the North, because if he was an SEC running back, that never would have happened. But it can happen up here because the sport is tilted, and too often really good Northern players can maybe at times fall through the cracks, and we don't want that to happen anymore. So it's September. But if you're having a Heisman conversation in September, and college football fans and media like to do that, he must be in that conversation.
Yeah, you look at it, and really remarkable also in terms of what he's done from last year to this year. But you look at, okay, you've got a guy from Boise State. Is that one of your 28 schools that?
So it's not a power conference school. It's clearly in the North, but it's not one of the focuses. But we had an Ashton Genty, Travis Hunter Heisman conversation 2 weeks ago about that. And so, yes, but we don't focus on Boise like we would focus on Iowa.
Well, anyway, so you have Ashton Genty, who's statistically ahead of Kaleb Johnson, but okay, yes, they've played Oregon, but the level of competition is a little different, with a Power Four school. And, of course, with my Heisman ballot as well, going to be looking at, Jackson Dart from Ole Miss, etc. But
Boo, no, you do not have to look at Jackson Dart. I am giving you permission to ignore Ole Miss. They beat Furman and Wake Forest. Why are you looking at Jackson Dart? Don't give in to the mania. Ole Miss is nothing. Ole Miss is nothing right now. And the idea that Jackson Dart is definitely in the Heisman conversation, but it took Kaleb Johnson this long to come in the back door is what's wrong with college football. Ole Miss is a mirage. Don't give in to that, John. You're of the North. Don't let them get to you, brother.
maybe my Iowa driver's license needs to be revoked for that comment.
I definitely will look at Jackson Dart. What is wrong with you? I'm gonna shake you through the video camera. That's what ESPN wants you to think. Well, you've got to think about Jackson Dart. Why? Why do I have to think? I haven't spent 5 seconds thinking about Jackson Dart this year. Let me know when Ole Miss plays somebody that matters.
Well, I'll spare you any Jalen Milroe discussion then.
At least I watched you. I was at the Wisconsin-Alabama game. He's a very good player. I get it. But don't bring me odds on he's got to be the guy conversation. Now, of course, Georgia-Alabama this week is a huge game. And if he destroys Georgia, and I do think Alabama will win that game, then okay, then for real, of course. I'm not going to be blind. I'm not going to be blind to it. But I also don't want to get caught up in the college football tidal wave of everything in the South is better. Swim against the tide, John. We're up here in the North. We're keeping our head above water. Swim against the tide.
Well, regardless of those quarterbacks down south, you look at the way that Kaleb Johnson has impacted this team too. Yeah. And I think that's another factor too, in terms of you look at this is not a team that's had a spectacular passing game, yet has improved their offensive ranks as much as they have, to the point of I think now they're 11th in rushing yards per game. It was a much different conversation 2 years ago, to say the least, when Iowa was about to play Ohio State. And that might have been the last time that we were talking on this podcast. Maybe there's one time since, but you look at how much the conversation has changed in terms of this Iowa offense around Kaleb Johnson. And I think that's something that kind of even goes beyond what these numbers show.
It's from atrocious to competent. It's okay, can you have the 80th best offense in the country? Can you have the 60th best? If you have the 60th best offense, that's twice as good as when you had the 130th best offense in the country. So that's all that was asked. And certainly from over here, from my view, it feels like Tim Lester is delivering on all of that, on competence. And I thought, was it the 3rd and 10 touchdown run against Minnesota?
Yeah, 3rd and 10 from the Minnesota 15.
Right? And that was the call there on 3rd and 10, the way they blocked that up with the cutback and the receiver coming around. It was like, well, there's a call. That's a play call. So that's the part of this too, is that you can see Kaleb Johnson is extraordinary, but you can also see the precision in the way this run game operates. He's running through gigantic holes at times, which is okay, he's great, but also even if the guy with the ball wasn't great, that play would have worked. So that's Tim Lester. That's great offensive line coaching. That's great offensive line play. That's guys on the perimeter making every block. That's how Michigan won, right? This is for 3 years, the number one thing about Michigan has been precision and technique in the run game. And I love for any team when you watch a play and then you go back on the old freeze it up machine and you freeze frame it, and then you just go through and you count all the guys making their blocks. And Iowa's doing that. So yes, they have a fantastic talent running the ball, but there's also a lot of guys doing their jobs with some nice play calls and situational stuff and a passing game that nobody is afraid of. So this is the thing, Michigan, balance in college football, balance in offense anywhere. Doesn't have to be run-pass balance. It just means, can you keep a defense off balance by having your version of balance? And so if you're creative in the run game, you run different ways, you threaten them in different ways, you don't have to be able to throw it great. And so it feels like they're much further down the line. Are they not?
Oh yeah,
Was it not
absolutely.
the last 4 years of like everybody in the building knowing exactly what every play call was, and then you knew beforehand that it wasn't going to work? So again, there have been some Andy Kotelnicki is getting a lot of love, deservedly so, as a new offensive coordinator hire at Penn State. That's not what Iowa had to do. It didn't have to be a splash. You just had to stop drowning, right? You're not trying to win the cannonball contest with the biggest splash. It's just like, oh, what's that dead body floating over there? Oh, it's the Iowa offense. Someone need to throw a little ring, right? You don't have to win. You don't have to be the best looking guy at the pool. Just float. Just be in your floaty and keep your head above water. That's Tim Lester. It's wonderful.
And the amazing thing too was here at Iowa back in, let's see, end of January, beginning of February, around that time, I don't think Tim Lester really excited the fan base a lot. I think a lot of fans are hoping for a splashier name. And then fast forward to August, and we're talking at Iowa's local media day, and he was talking about taking a lot of the stats. He didn't say which ones, but he talked about taking stats in half. So if they were 120th in something, he wants to be 60th. And I'm thinking, okay, I'll believe that when I see that. But that's what we're talking about right now.
It's the happiest 60th there ever was. We're number 60. We're number 60. It doesn't matter. What's the name of Iowa's new offensive coordinator? His name is not Brian Ferentz. Oh, great. Love the hire. That's all. Hey, put your name tag on. Hey, is your name Tim? Actually, my name is not Brian. Great. Who are you related to in the building? No one. Oh, welcome. It doesn't have to be a genius. It just has to be somebody who has some modicum of expertise and a tiny bit of a resume for the position. I was in on it. Again, for the Iowa fans who have lived through all of this, 1,000% get it. Like, they're traumatized by this. Like, not even joking. This is a thing that you pour your heart and soul into, and that's what you get for multiple years of just frustration every Saturday banging your head against the wall. So I get wanting to shoot for the moon. But I think I thought it was a very fine hire, and I think it has been a very fine result.
And you were mentioning too with the passing threat that nobody's really been afraid of. I think it was one pass for 20 plus yards. One pass attempt, I should say. One pass attempt against Minnesota for 20 plus yards. And yet you can have a running back who has a 200 rushing yard day. I think that just makes that even more impressive when I don't think nationally, you get a chance to see more of the national picture than me. But nationally, you just don't see all that often a team that can be that run dependent as much as Iowa has been through the first 4 games.
But it's a weird year in college football. There's actually a lot of offenses that are functioning right now by relying on quarterbacks running a decent amount. And Utah didn't throw a ton and beat Oklahoma State. Kansas State's having trouble throwing the ball. Rutgers is a heavy run first team with not a great passing attack. So that's the other thing too. I felt like for a couple of years there with a Trevor Lawrence or a Joe Burrow and Justin Fields and CJ Stroud and guys like that it felt like, man, if you don't have a NFL type quarterback, are you really going to compete at the top of the sport? And like, that is not Caleb Williams. Like, that is not where we are right now. There's a lot of offenses that I think are fine. There's no greater example than Michigan. Michigan threw for 32 yards and beat the number 11 team in the country. So Iowa fits much more into that world. And I have been around, I covered Ohio State in the Jim Tressel era where they were winning, but a lot of fans felt like they were getting left behind in the offensive revolution of college football then with the spread and throwing the ball around. And it was frustrating, even when to win, but be frustrated that it feels like there's a lid on what we can be. I don't know that there are a ton of, as much as Iowa is not good at throwing the ball, there's not a ton of teams that you're jealous of. Like, oh, I wish we could throw it like them. It's like, yeah, Quinn Ewers and Arch Manning are good at Texas or whatever. And I guess people try to tell me Carson Beck at Georgia is good. I don't know. But even
what do you
Alabama,
think about Jackson Dart?
I'm gonna kill you. I'm not. I wouldn't say that. I am gonna punch you next time I see you. Next time I see you at Shake Shack, I'm gonna punch you lightly on the shoulder. I'm gonna say, that's for Jackson Dart. Oh, tore up Furman. Oh my! I've never seen a guy throw the ball against Furman like that before. So you can win this way. Even Ohio State's not throwing the ball like they did with CJ Stroud, right? That Will Howard is a quarterback whose legs certainly matter. So it's not impossible for it to be a winning formula. And I think when you look at teams like Utah, Michigan, and Iowa, I think form like a little triangle, right? As I think about college football in Northern way now, we did a show earlier in the year of like who's sort of like your sister school that's just like you. And when you try to do North and South, but what I really came up with for Utah was like half Iowa, half Michigan, right? So like that. So when you see what Utah and Utah had to play a backup quarterback the last couple of weeks, right? So when you see like what Utah and Michigan have done and are doing, I think there's a lot there for Iowa to take heart in. And the bottom line in that is defense first, run game, and don't be incompetent. Don't be completely incompetent. Not good. They're not close to good throwing the ball. But, they still have Luke Lachey, and like you dial up something here and there. Didn't they throw a really good pass against Iowa State on one of the touchdowns?
Ooh, let's see.
Maybe that was Iowa State did it. Whoops. Sorry. No, I'll take it all back.
Yes,
So
yes.
listen, by
Rocco
the way,
Bex for Iowa State had the 75-yard touchdown.
No, I know that. I know that. Anyway, there have been in the last decade, there's been 2 or 3 good Iowa passing plays. Here's the thing, though, too. I think the Iowa State loss is going to be a really good loss. Iowa State is going to be very competitive in the Big 12. They don't play Kansas State and Utah and then Kansas State till the last 2 weeks of the year. So Iowa State's going to get attention. I think they're going to keep moving up the rankings, and that's nothing to be ashamed of. I thought Iowa State and Iowa would both be good coming into the year. I think that's right. I think that's a correct assessment. And so I think a really hard place to be in college football is to be good, but to be jealous. We're this, it's good, but man, I wish we were that. And I just don't think Iowa fans should be too jealous right now. Because what they are is very good, and there's not a ton of people doing other things a lot better. And by the way, 60th is better than 130.
Yes. The interesting thing with that Iowa State loss, too, is, obviously Cy-Hawk, big rivalry, but now the more that Iowa State can move up in the AP poll, and more importantly, the CFP rankings once those begin, that's better for Iowa because
absolutely.
Like I could picture a scenario where, especially when you look at what Iowa's schedule is after Ohio State, obviously Ohio State, which we'll talk about later, but you look at what it is afterwards, and you're talking about Washington, Michigan State, Northwestern, Wisconsin, UCLA, Maryland, Nebraska. None of those are ranked teams right now. And, Nebraska had a stint there, but they lose at home to Illinois and back to unranked there. So you look at it, and if you're a 10-2 Iowa team, if you could at least have potentially those 2 losses being Iowa State and Ohio State, if that week 2 loss turns out to be not as bad, that could help you out a lot. But it's also tough if you have a 10-win resume that doesn't have any of the 10 wins against ranked opponents.
No, that's hard. I think so. So the best case scenario for Iowa, well, the best case scenario is go beat Ohio State. If they don't beat Ohio State, you're 10-2, your 2 losses are to the Big 10 champ and the Big 12 champ, and eye test through the roof, the rest of it. Be a room, because as much as I like more when you talk about what teams deserve and you get analytical and you talk about strength of schedule, all those kind of things, but there are still old football people in that committee room, and the committee room is the only room that matters. Don't worry about the polls. In that committee room, if you have enough people saying, oh man, I wouldn't want to have to stop that Iowa Russian attack. Oh man, Phil Parker, have you seen that? Handle your business. So like the minute, like Minnesota's close and then take care of business in the second half, that's a whole baby moment in the committee room. So if that's your case for the 10th or 11th spot, 10-2, 2 teams we lost to are already in. And yeah, maybe we don't have a ton of ranked wins, but didn't we look awesome in those 10? That's in the conversation for sure.
Yeah. I don't think you'd put the odds at 70% there.
No,
I don't think you'd probably even put those at 50, but enough to at least be a discussion there.
in the
And,
discussion.
if I look back, I don't have the numbers in front of me, but I think they ended up with at 10-2, they're usually around like 15, 13, somewhere around there in
Yeah.
past years before losing to Michigan in the Big Ten championship game. And so that's at least in the conversation, which is
Yeah.
probably as much as you can ask for now.
Now, the problem is they're going to be having that conversation for the 10th or 11th spot, and then you're going to poke your head in the door and say, don't forget Jackson Dart. And they're going to put in Ole Miss at 9-3 ahead of 10-2 Iowa. So then the Hawkeye fans can blame you.
I never have been considered such a Jackson Dart fan until this podcast. I am
You are
not
the
that
biggest
much.
Jackson Dart fan in the state of Iowa, hands down. No doubt about it. I'm sending you a hat that says, I love Jackson Dart.
I will promise you I will never wear that hat.
Okay.
You can save your money. Save your money and buy me Shake Shack in Columbus.
Okay. Okay. That's fair. I'll do that instead.
Speaking,
I'm bringing you a hat. I'm bringing you a hat. I'm going to bring you a hat. Go ahead.
not
I'm going to bring, you have to, if I actually bring you a hat, you do have to wear it on this pod for 10 seconds. And then you can set it on fire. Then you can set it on fire with Ole Miss's playoff resume.
I'll consider that.
Okay.
I'll think about that. But that's a
take
good segue to the reason why I'll be in Columbus in
Yes.
a week and a half. Iowa playing at number 3 Ohio State right now. Probably would say a very good number 3. And if Ohio State had a stronger non-conference schedule, they'd probably be higher
Yeah.
than number
Untested,
3 right now.
untested number 3.
Yeah. Where, okay, Texas has played Michigan and, Georgia beat up Clemson.
And Georgia beat Kentucky by a point. Oh, we better put them second. Oh, they beat Kentucky by 1. Go Dogs. Crazy. I always put on my Georgia hat when I make fun of Georgia. By the way, I make fun of Georgia almost every show. Dog mentality. I have Georgia like 8th on my poll. So.
Well, regardless, a big test for Iowa. It seems like this is one of those games, especially with the game being in Columbus, that almost everything would have to go right for Iowa for this to be a competitive game on October 5th on CBS.
I think Iowa can compete. So Ohio State plays Michigan State this week on Saturday night. It's their first real test. It's been 2 MAC teams, a bye, and Marshall so far. So we don't know anything about Ohio State. Their defense is very good. I think they don't get a ton of pressure on the quarterback. Their secondary is really good. I think the secondary is the strength of the team, but Iowa doesn't throw it, so that doesn't matter. So I'm curious to see, like, Ohio. I've talked a lot about, I'm looking for Kaleb versus Kaleb, and this is Kaleb Johnson versus Kaleb Downs, the Ohio State safety who was a freshman at Alabama last year, led Alabama in tackles, is probably the best safety in the country. And I imagine whenever Kaleb Johnson is getting to the second level, they're going to meet each other a time or two. Sonny Styles, who's another highly rated recruit who was a safety and moved to linebacker this year, is like the off-ball linebacker for Ohio State. So I am really curious to see. Ohio State has good defensive tackles, like their edge guys are JT Tuimoloau is better probably against the run than he is against the pass as one of their edge guys. So I'm really curious to see how Iowa tries to run it and how effective they can be. I don't think they're going to be stonewalled by the Ohio State defense. And Ohio State and Iowa both have top 10 defenses, maybe better, maybe top 5. There's a lot of good defenses in the Big Ten. And then offensively, Will Howard is a good quarterback. He's not CJ Stroud. He's not Justin Fields. We were on our Ohio State show, we were talking about him as kind of maybe a version of JT Barrett, more throw first, where JT Barrett was run first, but good decision maker, tough, physical, not like, oh my gosh, he's blowing me off the field with his NFL arm talent. And then, of course, Ohio State has great skill. But again, like Phil Parker and Jay Higgins and everybody in the Iowa, Xavier Wampa and all those guys give you a chance. So I don't know that I would put it in the category exactly of like Iowa needs to play a perfect game to have a chance. I actually think I think Ohio State probably has the best secondary in the country. And I know Will Johnson at Michigan's really good, but like safeties and all their corners combined, I think Ohio State's the best. So it's like maybe bring in a team that doesn't even try to throw. Maybe that's a formula for playing Ohio State. So I'm super eager to see it, but I think Iowa can maybe hang around a little.
I think some of it too might go down to the way that this game kind of goes, where if Ohio State can build an early lead and if Iowa is playing catch up as a
Yeah,
run heavy team, I think that's a harder path. And nobody's figured out how to slow down Kaleb Johnson. It feels
yeah,
like I was joking with one person, like, okay, how long is it going to take Kaleb to get 100 yards today
yeah,
when I
right,
was in Minneapolis? And where's an inevitability at this point.
yeah,
They haven't faced a defense, I think, at Ohio State's caliber. Iowa State has
agreed.
a respectable defense, but Ohio State's at another level.
Yeah.
And, you know, if you can force Iowa to not be so run heavy, I think that would be a good formula for Ohio State.
And I guess, but the question is like, how do you force Iowa to not be so run heavy?
Mhm.
So obviously, it's like, all right, I could even see, we've been talking a lot about like Ohio State definitely wants to play two safeties, two outside corners, and a nickel corner, right? Like that's what they want to play. But there's going to be situations they have their third linebacker is again like a super highly recruited young guy. It's probably Arvell Reese, who's a second year guy. It could be CJ Hicks, who's a third year guy. I'll be curious like how often maybe they just play three linebackers in that game and take the nickel corner off the field. We do know, and again, it's some of these things. It's just jerseys, and it doesn't have any relevance. So the fact that when Iowa beat Ohio State in 20, wait, is it 17 or 18?
I think it's
2017.
2017. If we're
2017.
wrong, I'm going to hear about it from.
No, because I always get confused because Ohio State lost to Iowa one year and Purdue one year. And I get confused, but it was Purdue in 18. It was Iowa in 17. And that game, right? It's TJ Hawkinson and Noah Fant go crazy and they can't, Ohio State can't cover the tight end. It's like, okay, well, here it's a complete nobody on this defensive coaching staff was part of that defensive coach. I guess Larry Johnson, the defensive line coach, was. So anyway, like, does that matter? Well, but that Iowa's still that. Right? Iowa
Yeah.
still wants to throw the ball to tight end. And once upon a time, they killed Ohio State with that. And that team was lacking, I think, had bad linebacker coaching that year, and they took advantage of the Ohio State linebackers. They have good linebacker coaching now because James Laurinaitis, the former Buckeye linebacker, is the linebackers coach. But at least like you've seen it. And that was the best game Nate Stanley ever played. That was the best game Nate Stanley ever played because Brian Ferentz, like earlier in the spring, I had said that I thought Ohio State might have like three of the best 8 quarterbacks in the Big Ten because they had Dwayne Haskins, Joe Burrow, and Tate Martell. And Brian Ferentz went like out of his way to take offense to that and brought it up at a news conference at Iowa like a month later. It was like, I don't even know. It's like, how dare I like imply that Tate Martell was better than Nate Stanley? Brian Ferentz had it out for me even before Kirk Ferentz knew I was that guy. So the Iowa way is the same. And Ricky Stanzi competed like crazy against Ohio State. The Iowa way, the Kirk Ferentz way, has beaten Ohio State. I mean, it doesn't beat them every time, but it has beaten Ohio State. And it has also competed with Ohio State in situations where you would have said going in, well, Ohio State's more talented, which is what you would say now. So that's the thing. Ohio State's changed since those games, but Iowa really hasn't. And we're not asking Cade McNamara to be Caleb Williams, but could he be a version of Nate Stanley for a day? Be the best of who you are and throw it to the tight end and let Kaleb Johnson run for 200? That's not a fanciful, impossible notion to me, right? That doesn't feel like you need Tinkerbell to come down and sprinkle pixie dust on that idea. It's like, no, that's what Iowa tries to do, and maybe it'll work.
And I think the other interesting thing is going to be, we were talking to Tim Lester yesterday with the bye week, and, it seemed like maybe some of the wide receiver route running hasn't been quite perfect. And if you can get that in line, I don't think you can play mistake heavy football. I look
Right.
back to was it first play, second play, something really early on 2 years ago where Peters throws the interception and that kind of I felt like set the tone to a large
Yeah.
extent in 2022. You can't like the passing game needs to let Kaleb Johnson do his thing in this game and not be a liability, which is a much easier thing said than done against the secondary.
Yeah. Yeah. So that, I mean, they're going to make it hard, but, I mean, that's one of those things too. If you play and get them in three linebackers and get them playing the run and then you throw out of that, like maybe that's what works. And so it'll be fun to have like Caleb Brown, one-time Ohio State Buckeye player coming back for this, right? So I do not, especially in a world, and it's not a terrible thing. I'll be curious to see how much Michigan State can hang with Ohio State this week. I mean, young quarterback, a lot of new guys there. They have some talent, but Iowa certainly, I think, is a better place to compete than Ohio State is. But like Ohio, it very likely, I don't think that Ohio State's a 24-point favorite against Michigan State. I don't think the huge test for Ohio State comes Saturday. So I think the result is that Ohio State goes into the Iowa game a little untested, where Iowa has went to the wall with Iowa State. So like that's not nothing either.
The interesting thing, at least with Michigan State, it's more of a challenge than Marshall. Like I remember driving up to Minneapolis and looking at these 11 a.m. games beforehand, thinking, oh, maybe there's a good one to listen to. It's like
No.
Marshall, Ohio State,
Fox did big noon for that.
which is wild to me.
Fox is addicted to Ohio State, and so they were like, oh, we haven't had Ohio State in 3 weeks. We got to go. It's Marshall, guys. Do you know it's Marshall? Doesn't matter. Set up the set in the parking lot. I need some Ohio State. So Ohio State's a huge draw, and Ohio State always plays a huge non-conference game. I think it was Washington was the scheduled, like the long scheduled out non-conference game, and so then that didn't happen, and so they just wound up with this terrible schedule. Ohio State opens at home against Texas next year. So like this is it's not like Ohio State's scared to play these games. They just didn't this year. And the result is we know they're good. They just haven't been tested or have had a chance to show it against a good opponent. But the Iowa defense is that good opponent, man. Caleb Johnson is a good opponent.
One question I'd throw your way, kind of ahead of this, you watching more Ohio State than I have here. What's the biggest thing that Iowa fans should be watching during this Ohio State-Michigan State game in terms of getting a sense of just how difficult is this challenge of going to Ohio State going to be?
So like you certainly want to watch the true freshman receiver, Jeremiah Smith, who's the best freshman receiver in the country and might be in the conversation for the best receiver in the country by the end of the year. But it really is the two-headed monster at running back, TreVeyon Henderson and then Quinshon Judkins, who transferred here from Ole Miss. We thought of them maybe as like a thunder and lightning. Judkins is more physical. Henderson's the more breakaway guy. They've both looked explosive and they've both broken tackles. So I said it's like the lightning and the thunder are rubbing off on each other. And they're fresh. It helps, TreVeyon Henderson's been injured a decent amount in his Ohio State career, so they want to keep him fresh. They also want to have a plan in case he gets hurt. And then Will Howard as a quarterback who is a run threat, which Kyle McCord at quarterback was not that for Ohio State last year. They have not run him much yet, but my co-host Bill and I just did a show today about the idea of Will Howard as a runner. And I said, like, would it shock you if Iowa goes out to stop what Ohio State's done so far, which is run it with the running backs and throw it to the receivers? And the result is we get like 16 Will Howard carries for 91 yards against Iowa. And he said, no, that wouldn't shock him. So I think that's the next piece of the Ohio State offense that hasn't been used yet. I don't know if it'll be used against Michigan State, but I think Iowa fans should be prepared for that regardless, because I think when you face a defense as good as Iowa, you're going to need everything. And they want to, with Chip Kelly, I think Iowa fans maybe know this, Chip Kelly was Ryan Day's mentor. He was the guy who recruited. Chip Kelly was the offensive coordinator at the University of New Hampshire. Ryan Day was a high school quarterback. They went to the same high school in New Hampshire. Chip Kelly recruited Ryan Day. Then he coached Ryan Day. Then he's been Ryan Day's mentor. When Chip Kelly was a head coach of the Philadelphia Eagles, he hired Ryan Day to be the quarterback's coach there. Now Chip Kelly is back working for his protege. He's brought a lot more nuance and creativity to the run game. So he's calling the plays, they're working in concert, but that's the big difference. So as much as maybe Iowa fans are used to Ohio State in the Ryan Day era chucking it around, that's not who they are. They actually are a defense-first team and a run-first offense that also still happens to have Emeka Egbuka and Jeremiah Smith at receiver. So, like, they're hard to stop, but they haven't played anybody good yet.
Yeah, and I think I remember seeing the rush defense numbers are fantastic for them, but I guess they probably should be when you're going up against schools like Marshall.
They're just they haven't faced anybody. And I'll be curious. See, Michigan State has a 2-back system, right? They have 2 real guys, Nate Carter, and I always get the other guy's name wrong. But I'll be curious to see. Yeah, it's just a step up. But I mean, I don't know if we're gonna say. I mean, this is the best running back Ohio State's gonna face. You know, I mean, like Nick Singleton and Katron Allen at Penn State are good, and Donovan Edwards and Kalel Mullings at Michigan are good, and Jordan James at Oregon is good, but they're not as good as Kaleb Johnson. No. So it's just a question of, because like that's the thing. Is it like, can anybody stop Kaleb Johnson? That's the question. That's the question, really. It's not really, because if anybody can, Ohio State's the type of defense that can, but the answer might be nobody can. Mm-hmm. So I think to wind it back to the Heisman case just very quickly, like what Kaleb Johnson has to do is either have a gigantic game against a good team like Ohio State when everybody's watching, because right, the Heisman's 3 things. The Heisman is stat accumulation. Got it. It's what's the other one? It's mostly it's highlights, stat accumulation, highlights, which are just brief moments. Right? It's the thing they put on in the middle of your game. And now we'll go to Iowa City. Kaleb Johnson with the 57-yard touchdown run. Right? Those he has those, but then you need a moment. You need a moment, and so there's 2 ways to get like your cohesive big moment. It's either to do it on a huge platform against a good team, or it's just to go bazonkers. So the case, like the Melvin Gordon Heisman case in 2014, when he was one of the 3 finalists, and I think anything a Wisconsin running back did to be part of the Heisman conversation, an Iowa running back can do. Melvin Gordon ran for 405 yards and 4 touchdowns against somebody. He broke the single game rushing yardage. It wasn't against a good team. He just went crazy. So either Kaleb Johnson can do that against average team X, just go 31 for 423, and I think he'll go to New York. Or be really good against Ohio State. He's not going to run for 4. I'll make this prediction. Kaleb Johnson will not run for 400 yards against Ohio State. But if he drops 150 on Ohio State, which I think he could, that doesn't mean Iowa's going to win. People will notice. We'll for my show, I bought a sword because we're the kings of the North. We will beat people. I won't stab people. I'm not going to stab people with a sword. That wouldn't be nice. But I will slap you with my sword. If Kaleb Johnson runs for 150 against Ohio State and people aren't putting him in the Heisman conversation, I'm going to slap anybody who doesn't.
If he goes for 400, I will buy a sword myself.
But
I agree with you. I don't think he's a run for 400.
I have 200. I have 200. I have 2 swords. So I'll bring my 2 swords in my trunk to the Ohio State Iowa game, and if he runs for 400, I'll just give you one of my swords. I'll be like, you have earned it, my liege. And then, but you have to give it to Kaleb Johnson. Then it'll be like, hey, John, give Kaleb Johnson this sword on behalf of Kings of the North. So
the real picture that just painted in my head as you're telling me that is me trying to explain to TSA at Columbus why I'm trying to bring a giant sword on the plane.
No. Just say it's from Kings of the North, and they'll be like, "Oh, I love that show. It's fine."
Solid.
We're going everywhere. Actually, we're not going everywhere yet, which is why I hope Iowa fans will give us a shot.
Well, I think we pretty much have covered everything. So, Doug, thanks for joining me.
Kings of the North on YouTube, on Twitter, on Instagram, and wherever you listen to podcasts. KOTN, CFB, and Kings of the North. Thanks, John.
Yes, thank you. And thanks to our listeners. Until next time, we will talk Hawks later.